Hello, everybody, and welcome to our fifth and final session of the 2019 IEEE Women in Engineering International Leadership Conference virtual track. My name is David Stankwitz. I am the moderator and event producer for this session and this series. Today, we are joined by Vesha Parker. Let me tell you a little bit about the session and what we're going to get into today, and then I'll give you a very brief bio on Vesha before I kick things over to her to present for today's, hopefully about an hour presentation. So today's session is going to discuss the following. As a tech lead on a product team, resiliency is an important skill to learn. You often are the stopgap between the very different disciplines of design, engineering, and product management. That is to say, sometimes you're the structural beams holding the house together. And Vesha is going to talk a little bit more about what that means and how that applies to you out there in the audience. I'm going to read Vesha's bio quickly, and then I'm going to let you know how you can participate in today's session, because we do want to make it an interactive one, and we want to hear from you, the audience. So Vesha Parker is a senior software engineer and tech lead at Etsy, where she builds order management software for small businesses. Outside of her work at Etsy, Vesha is a director at Progressive Hack Night, where she helps run meetups and works to make open source projects in the progressive space more sustainable. And when she's not working, she loves to make art, and she frequents a local pottery studio. So now that you know about the session and a little bit about Vesha as well, if you're out there in the audience, what I'd like to do is invite you to look at the right-hand side of your screen where there's a chat window. This is a public forum where you can just communicate with one another or myself and Vesha throughout the session. You can also ask questions here. In addition to that, if you look at the bottom of your screen, there should be an Ask a Question tab. And we'd like you to just ask questions throughout the entire session. You can put your questions in there and then upvote your favorite ones to see which ones you want to see asked. And at the end of Vesha's presentation, she'll take as many of those questions as possible. And so without further ado, what I'd like to do is hand the floor over to Vesha. I'm going to turn my camera off and let her take it away and pull up her presentation. So Vesha, over to you.
Thank you. And hi, everyone. Welcome to the session. Cool. So I am going to start by sharing my screen in just a second. So welcome to the talk. Hi, I'm Vesha, as David mentioned, and I'm a senior software engineer and technical lead at Etsy. And I'm here to talk to you today about building resilience on your product teams as a technical lead. So for the agenda we have coming up is like some first steps to sort of set your mind in the right space for this talk around resilience. Then we're going to dive into a little bit on what constitutes tech leading, at least for the purposes of this talk, since many different companies have completely different definitions of what it means to be a technical lead. And then lastly, we'll dive into sort of 3 steps or 3 ways that I can see us as like growing resilience on teams. So we have a decent agenda, so let's go ahead and dive in. So first up is the first step towards resilience. And I want to begin by pointing out that the purpose of this talk is not to discuss fail-proof ways to make your team avoid any road bumps or roadblocks in the product development cycle, as I don't actually believe that that level of perfection is possible. So instead, we want to focus on minimizing the disruption of the unexpected. So that is either protecting your team from the brunt of what goes wrong, or helping them navigate out of a failure state to a more stable place that folks can move on from. And so the first real step to building a more resilient team is to acknowledge that most projects will have something go wrong. And the extent to which something might go wrong is what we're here to talk about today, and how to set up our teams to avoid and bounce back from those hiccups. And this acknowledgement is the first step in the process, because truly anything can go wrong with your projects, from staffing issues where you don't have as many people working on the project as you assume for estimates, to the engineering timelines themselves being incorrect, which most estimates around work that has not yet been done are incorrect. And also, many of us have felt the frustration of shifting company priorities impacting our projects. So that's all to say that anything can go wrong, and we need to be okay with that up front. So your goal here is to allow your team to remain unblocked and enjoy their work. And the motivation for this is that part of a technical lead's role is to make sure that engineers have the clarity and focus time to be able to do their work instead of focusing on all the glue work that often surrounds the running of a project. So part of your role is essentially serving as a batter, keeping the field of vision for engineers on the project clear. And so the question isn't really how to make sure that nothing goes amiss, but rather to make sure that you're minimizing the impact of roadblocks that do arise on your team. So great. Now we have some expectation setting out of the way, and we can discuss the type of tech lead that's most relevant to this talk. So if I had to personally describe my role as a technical lead in 6 phrases, they'd be the ones shown here. So guiding engineering standards, working along with product and design leads to help guide the team, leading the engineering effort on scoping out work and handling timelines, prioritizing technical work and tech debt, contributing regularly to the code base as a programmer, hence the technical part of being a tech lead, and also making sure that engineers can focus on their work at hand and remain unblocked and unbothered by all the other stuff that goes on with the project. So among the most important of those 6 things, in my opinion, are guiding engineering standards, serving as a product and design partner, and unblocking engineers. And we'll be focusing on the last one for the talk, and we won't really touch on the technical ways that you might make a product more resilient and safe against like unknown bugs and stuff like that. So why discuss the non-technical bits of tech leading now? And I'd like to build a case for this. So strong technical ability, thought, and leadership should be a given for a technical lead, and I'll continue to agree that that's important. But the importance of those skills drops a lot when your team and project are falling apart and no one can actually get any work done. So time spent strengthening your ability to protect and care for your team is actually time really well spent. And with that, I'd actually like to add one last responsibility to this list that I think is necessary for everything else in this presentation. And that's to lead by example with open, honest, and empathetic communication with your teammates. So establishing a relationship with your teammates that sets you as someone who operates blamelessly and actually wants what's best for the team will help you a lot, especially when it comes to picking up on issues that are about to bite you down the road. So we'll touch on that more shortly. But now that we've leveled on the high-level role of a technical lead, let's dive in to see how you can create a more resilient team and project. So I like to think about the work that I do to build resilience on my team in sort of 3 steps or 3 phases. And these 3 steps are lightly chronological, but you should be constantly doing them and learning from all 3 in practice. And they don't necessarily have to come one after the other. But I think that this order makes a lot of sense. So first step is expectation setting. And I like to start with expectation setting because it's hard to know if something is going wrong on your team if the expected case of how your team functions is unknown. And I typically break expectation setting into 2 categories. So 1, team member roles and responsibilities, and 2, expectations around the project you're working on. So for team roles and responsibilities, the questions there should essentially answer what someone does, what the team should be able to expect from them, and what they need from the team. And if someone is a lead on the team, so product, design, or engineering, like you as a technical lead, you might also want to answer a question of what meetings you own for the team. And you can structure this similarly to agile team norming meetings, but the actual format of that doesn't matter as long as you can answer those 3 to 4 questions. And when combined from answers from everyone on the team, the answers of these questions paint a picture of how the team is expected to run. So you don't have to question ownership when it seems like the ball is being dropped somewhere. And the same goes for other members of the team. So next up is expectations around the project itself that your team is working on. And understanding those expectations doesn't have to follow a particular format, but team members should at least know what to expect in the next 2 weeks and what milestone for their project is coming up next, so they can put their work into the context of the larger project. And I found this especially helpful through sending either weekly or bi-weekly or sprintly engineering digests to the whole team, so everyone understands what the work is that's coming up next, what the expectations are in terms of current milestones that we should be hitting, and what work might seem to be blocked, so we're all on the same page there. And team leads should have a more detailed vision than everyone else necessarily needs to have for project expectations, and they should have like a higher level vision about what to expect further out, usually through the end of the project if the project has a reasonably sized scope. So I know that some people dislike meetings that feel processy, and you've probably either you have complained about too many process meetings or you've heard another engineer complain about them. And I think that there are a few ways to work around this. If you do decide that something like a team norming meeting is the best way to set those roles and expectations type of expectations or decisions, sorry. So first off, I would like to note that anyone who dislikes process meetings are also likely to dislike the side effects of a team without clear expectations more, this might take the role or the shape of always having to ask or repeatedly asking who owns something, or not knowing what to do and it seems like something's going wrong, and not knowing who should be owning making that thing go right. So generally, I think that this push against process doesn't necessarily make a ton of sense, but if you still get pushback on adding too much process and don't want to force folks to do it, you can always do this asynchronously in a collaborative document where everyone details their own role and comments on others' roles when they have time, so you can avoid a meeting. And you can even do this via one-on-ones over coffee, and you can separately keep track of all of this in a doc. And the how basically doesn't matter so much as that the team members know what to expect from one another. So it's easier to identify when things are going right and when they're taking a bad turn. So next up is early detection of upcoming issues. So basically, once you have expectations set on a project and personal role level, you can all better tell, and especially you can better tell when those expectations aren't being met. And I would like to add a caveat on micromanaging. So this isn't to say that you should be micromanaging your team or making sure that every little thing is happening on time. Little stuff comes up, and if you sweat it, people will get annoyed with you, I think rightfully so. So instead here, we're really looking for larger deviations from expectations. And my favorite way to identify what has the potential to slow my team down is to learn from my team members. So hopefully you have a team dynamic that allows for this. So as I mentioned before, in addition to just being a nice person, this is why it's important to lead empathetically and ask for your coworkers' opinions often. And when they give you your opinion, when they give you their opinion, it's additionally important to actually act on them if there's some reasonable action item coming from what they're saying, so that they know that when they're offering their opinions that might feel risky to them, they're not falling on deaf ears and they're not wasting their time by speaking to you. So establishing meaningful lines of communication with them early on means that later down the road, when problems do arise, that line is already in place for them to vocalize the concerns that you'll end up being really glad to hear. So, but in the case that team concerns aren't being surfaced organically, you do have a few options. And the first one is premortems. So I typically aim to do this about a month before a product launch, but it can really happen anytime. And premortems basically serve as a place to identify the team's opinions on the biggest ways that you as a team might fail in your product, and what you can do to gain confidence that those failure states will never happen, or at least reduce the likelihood that they will happen. And as the engineers on the team are probably going to be a bit closer to the code base than you are, they'll be especially helpful here, as they've likely been thinking about this and ruminating on this in their minds throughout the entirety of the project. So concerns that arise in this meeting can be anything from where systems might fail and how that will really mess up the team, to how team dynamics themselves might be derailing the project down the line. So come to the meeting ready to listen and try to discern what actionable items you can take from that to put the team in a better place. So then there are also meetings that I like to hold when things just don't feel right. And this is a bit of a gut check meeting, like when the team seems overcome with a shadow of impending doom because something is amiss, but no one's really talking about it. Create the forum to talk about it. Like, people are probably stressed, and that will impact their work and their happiness and everything else. And sometimes just being the force that creates a space that everyone can speak openly about those feelings helps a lot. And these meetings sometimes surface the most interesting learnings because sometimes, they surface the most interesting learnings about the team. But you should also consider team dynamics when you set up the meeting. Be sure that the people in the room will feel comfortable talking to each other, especially if team dynamics might be part of what is causing the issue of, or the feeling of, impending doom. So ask yourself, like, would folks prefer that there are no leads in the meeting, including yourself sometimes? Like, would they prefer to speak just as non-leads and deliver some conclusion at the end that you can take action from? Or should there only be team leads at the meeting? Or is the entirety of the team dynamic so off kilter that one-on-ones would be best? It's up to you to read the temperature in the room and bring the combination of people in that you will think will lead to the best learning for the team. And it's also totally fine to hold multiple of these meetings to understand in smaller groups, like, what is going on. So in these meetings, it's important to give everyone the space they need to vent, to rant, or say whatever they need. And you should be serving as the mediator, guiding that conversation towards action items that you can eventually assign out so everyone feels ownership over getting your team to a better space. And usually you can come out of these with knowledge around everything from social dynamics to unforeseen technical blockers that have derailed things. So as much value as you'll gain from talking openly with your team about problems on the horizon, you should also have your own internal sense for when something is amiss and be able to use your own high-level view into the project to do so. So I typically and personally rely on Gantt charts, like the one shown here, to understand roughly where we should be in a project versus where we are. And I like to combine this with the general listening to coworkers when they chat to get a better lay of the land as to why something might be going amiss. So in the case where perhaps an engineer has mentioned being blocked by another team's code review every day for the last week in stand-up, that's usually something that's really helpful for me when updating the Gantt chart or understanding why things aren't meeting expectation. And I make sure to note and later follow up and address all of those little things that come up that impact expectation, meaning what you have planned in your Gantt chart, versus reality, what engineers are actually able to do. And I feel the need to repeat that this can easily fall into the space of micromanaging, but we should instead be looking at larger swings that look off. So let's talk about this more coming up. So your real focus here is the big swings between the current state of the project and its hopefully evolving expectations. So I typically break this into two categories: start and end issues. So for start issues, when you identify that work is repeatedly unable to start, though an engineer is available for that additional work, that usually points to blockers, generally by product or design. And if these blockers can't be resolved by simply bringing them to the attention of whoever needs to unblock the work, you can at least set the expectations around needing to push back timelines or cut scope. And here, the benefit of using a Gantt chart to help identify this is that you can also look forward to see if anything can be moved, or if any like future work can be moved up to solve for these gaps, while whoever is responsible for the blockers can take the time to address them. Now for end issues, when you see that at the tail end of planned work, you keep missing it, or whoever's working on it keeps missing it in a big way. So not just that a deliverable comes 2 or 3 days late, but maybe that's like 5 days off or more. This can sometimes be caused by blockers, but it's generally an issue that engineering work has greater complexity than it was initially anticipated to have when the work was first estimated. So either way, regardless of what you think the issue actually is, you should naturally talk to the engineer and just see what's up. If you're an open and honest and empathetic tech lead, generally people will be willing and sort of relieved to open up to you about this, so they can give you their opinion on what's actually going on. But in addition to talking to them, you should check for scope creep. Like, did an engineer start working on this work only to find that they kept receiving new acceptance criteria and new tasks to do as part of that, that made it impossible for them to handle the initial, or the work in the initially planned time. You can also check for repetitive QA cycles or quality assurance cycles or test cycles that might be having a lot of back and forth between the engineer and whoever's testing their code, and see if that's slowing things down. But in any case, you can also see, as a way to sort of reduce the stress on the engineer and reduce the tension in the team, you can see if you can cut the project scope or see if the timeline could be updated to sort of keep things going and make sure that there isn't a feeling of constant failure around not meeting a deadline, but instead acknowledging that this just happens and that's fine and the team can move on. So you can basically let the comparison of current work to planned work guide you through much of this detection phase, along with the input from your team members or teammates. So the last part of increasing resilience on your team is handling remediation when something goes wrong and figuring out how to help the team move on. You should hopefully count success as catching big issues early and not stressing the team with them. And that often involves giving up something to do that, and I'll explain. So hopefully the combination of expectation setting and roadblock surfacing can help you and your team identify issues early enough to address them. But sometimes issues don't surface until they're way too far gone to fix in a comfortable way. So I like to think of the 3 areas that I might have control over to give up to keep a project running sanely as project scope, staffing, and timeline. And you generally have to determine which of these you would realistically have the most control over. Sometimes that answer is none, but hopefully it's at least one. And you can generally hold the other 2 steady at best. So let's look at these individually. So for cutting scope, you can cut scope when there's no available headcount to add to a project when things are falling behind and the timeline is not mutable. So this should be done in partnership with the project manager and probably also the other engineers, but especially the project manager, because they are typically keeping track of the priorities of upcoming work. And if that's not an option, you might add engineers to the project. And I'm not always a fan of this option. I'm actually rarely a fan of this option. But if no features can be cut from the project to reduce scope and the timeline still can't budge, you can request more engineers to help out. But I do like to note that more engineers doesn't always make work go quicker, and folks will need to take time away from the project to ramp them up. So this could actually end up slowing the team down in the end and adding stress. So that's part of why I don't really recommend this. But if it's all you can do, it's all you can do. But lastly, if scope must remain the same and there's no additional headcount available, you need to update the timeline to account for whatever delay your project's facing. And this time around, I think it's important to discuss what seems to be the most important to the project manager and the engineers, and where the greatest uncertainty lies in the work involved in doing that. So I like to rely on doing day-long spikes to learn more about what you don't already know here and how that can help with updating your timelines. And always remember to reasonably pad those timelines, especially if you just have to push it back, so you don't end up in the cycle where new work or leftover work continues to be underestimated in terms of time, and you have to keep pushing back the timeline, because I think that that really weighs heavy on the psyche of the team, and it makes people feel like they're failing, when really this is just something that happens as a product team, and it should be completely okay. So if none of those things are the option, like if your company accepts none of these remediation options when something goes wrong, then I'm sorry, but I can't really help. But that may also say something about how the company leads might not completely face reality, so that's just some food for thought. So all of that is fine and dandy as ways to either try to prevent something from going really wrong, or catching things before they go really wrong, or finding ways that you can update expectations around scope, staffing, timelines when something goes wrong. But sometimes, no matter what you do, things just go really horribly, and the team is really bummed about it, and you're really bummed about it. So the question is sort of, what can you do in this case? I get that. So when things go really poorly, it's still important to try to extract some learning from it or some value from it, both personally and for your team. So one of the tools I really love for this is team postmortems. I think that those can be really useful to understand all the little things that went wrong that led to whatever disaster your team is facing. And postmortems can be held to better understand a technical failure or why something went dramatically wrong for your team. So, but it's worth noting that these meetings must be held blamelessly in order for them to work well. So it's best to establish what happened and why the team was surprised by how those things went wrong. And from that, the team can then come to understand the larger narrative that the issue points out about the team, and perhaps how that might be addressed. Then it's up for the team leads to make sure that what was decided in the meeting actually comes to life. And I also usually like to follow up postmortems or just the end of any project with a personal change log that I keep for myself as a lead. So in that change log, I track or I note what the team needed from me to avoid not providing that thing in the future, along with how I helped or hindered the team in my role. And the information from this can come from your own reflection about how things went, or asking teammates for their feedback, which can be anonymously. I think that usually anonymous feedback is the most honest, or just what comes out of the team postmortem if you choose to have one. And with each new experience for projects, I like to add new lines about what I learn about myself as a lead and my impact on the team. So after each project, I note what I want to be sure I do differently in the future, and I just keep it as a gist on my personal GitHub, so I always have record of it. Then, at the start of a new project, it's easy to review that list and put my mind in the right space to take all of the learnings I've absorbed from past projects into the new project space with me. And this has been immensely helpful in growing as a tech lead. So, as you do each of these things, I know the word empathy keeps coming up, but as you do each of these things, remember to do it all with empathy. And most of us go to work hoping to bring our best game with us, but sometimes life just gets in the way. So assume best intent of your teammates and try to understand why things are going wrong instead of casting blame. And you'll foster a healthier team and hopefully learn a lot from your teammates in the process. So, thank you. Thank you all for listening in, and I'm happy to take some questions. If you want to find me online, I have my LinkedIn and my Twitter right there, and I'm happy to catch up online. But I can take questions now.
Lavisha, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I am going to come back on camera. I'm sorry, folks, but I do want to leave this slide up just for a moment so people could take note of how to get in touch with you. If you have a question, please use the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen or the chat window on the right to ask Lavisha a question. And while we wait for some questions to populate and I come back on camera, I'm going to ask you some questions myself. if that's okay.
Yep.
And so I'm a non-technical person. I work at a technical organization at IEEE, but I'm a non-technical person. And so I was taking some notes, and one of the big questions that I had are, you talked about mid-project bringing in more engineers and the need for that if the project calls for it. What are your thoughts and experiences about involving non-technical people into a tech project, whether that be at the outset or during a project, like mid-project? And I don't know if you have a personal experience from Etsy you can sort of cite, but I'm sure, as an engineer, you sort of work across the organization, right? You may partner with other departments. So any thoughts around that? Any suggestions about how to assimilate non-technical people into a tech project?
Yes. So I think that first up, it's really important to develop a sense of how to break technical and sometimes deeply technical concepts into something that's digestible by anyone that you might be working with or speaking to who isn't technical, just to make sure that as the team is discussing what everyone thinks is the current state of the project or the current work that needs to be moved forward, everyone is actually understanding in the same way and not silently not understanding what's being said. I also think that for the most part, it's been helpful, especially at Etsy, to take the time to determine how closely someone from a non-technical discipline actually needs to work with engineers. Like sometimes I've had situations where someone tries to protect the team or the team of engineers from having to or from interfacing with someone who isn't necessarily technical, but that ends up just delaying the project and making things take way longer because that person is serving as a liaison from technical to non-technical, and it just, to me, doesn't always make sense. So I like to take the time to evaluate how closely someone needs to work together. For a project I recently tech led, we had to work sort of closely with finance. So it was our finance team and some of our accounting analysts. So it was really useful to sit in meetings with the engineer who was handling the financially related work and with the finance people also in the room so that we could all speak openly and understand each other without me either choosing to be the intermediary or someone else doing that. So I hope that answers your question.
No, it does, and it's excellent advice, and it kind of leads into, it's very similar to the question that Godiva put in the question queue. Thanks, Godiva. And she asks, what advice do you have for non-technical product development leads? So, looking at it from a lead perspective, somebody who's a non-technical product development lead, do you have any advice in that way?
Yes. So as a non-technical product development lead, that's a bit of a mouthful. I think that it's even more important then to try to delegate someone as your point person, or maybe a few people on the engineering team if you're speaking about how to do this with the engineering team, to delegate a few point people that you found are really good at explaining things and don't indicate that they prefer to spend their time just writing code and not interacting with other people, and establish them as your partners in leading the team. I don't think that a technical background is necessary at all for leading a team, but it will definitely help to have someone there who you can ask questions to if you maybe don't understand what the team is talking about when they're talking about branching on GitHub or something, just as an example.
Yeah.
So having that liaison can really help. But I'll also say take the time to understand or to try to get a feeling for what types of conversations or what types of decisions the team wants to be part of. One thing I've really loved that a product manager who wasn't technical that I worked with in the past did was when we first started working together, he set up one-on-ones with everyone on the team, and he just asked what type of decisions do you want to be part of, and how do you want me to work with you? And having the space to be able to speak about that honestly and openly really helped me and how I interacted with him and how much I trusted him to lead us as a technical team with a non-technical project manager.
Awesome. Excellent. Thanks, Godiva, for the question. Excellent question.
Thank you.
I'm going to invite other people to continue to ask questions. Now that Lavisha's slide has been up for quite a little bit, Lavisha, if you could just minimize that, we'll both go back to full screen mode. There we go. Perfect. Okay, so while we wait for some more questions to populate, I have some more on my phone here, and I'm going to ask another one. Let me pick. Okay, so you mentioned sort of process meetings and maybe doing things if people weren't fans of that, doing things sort of asynchronously, excuse me, in sort of some sort of shared space or shared document where people can sort of just continually update others from the team on the project. In that vein, in that sort of shared space, that shared document, do you have any recommendations on tools or apps or anything in that way that you could suggest to best sort of move a team along and or collaboratively work in the same sort of environment?
Yep. So I typically rely pretty heavily on Google Docs, which is probably a basic answer, but I love that everyone can collaborate equally and also comment on what other people have mentioned. So especially in something like an asynchronous norming doc, where you're all saying like, this is what I think I'm supposed to do. This is what the team will get from me. This is what I think the team needs from me. It's super useful to be able to comment as a team member and say like, actually, this is how I feel about what I as an engineer or I as a product manager, or I as a designer need from you. So I really love that because it can mimic just in an asynchronous fashion the type of conversations that you would have if you did hold a meeting or something like that. And for those, if I notice that I'm in a doc and if I'm trying to figure out this stuff asynchronously and I'm in a doc and we just keep going back and forth in comments, like it's also easy to then just pull that one person aside and talk about something in real life, or if they're remote, talk about it like via video chat, or just like hop in a Slack or IRC, whatever chat your company uses, direct message and hash it out, and then bring whatever that decision is back into the doc. So yeah.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, I mean, sometimes just you mentioned like it's just sort of a generic answer, Google Docs, but maybe the basic sometimes is, the non-sexy way to do it, and just a Google Doc is the way to do it. So you mentioned Slack is another one. Slack's great. I use Slack for collaboration and team projects. So awesome. Okay. I have another question. So you had mentioned earlier in the presentation, Lavisha, meetings when things just don't feel right. Something is off and you need to call a meeting. Is that like creating white space for people to voice their opinions openly? Can you talk a little bit more about that and sort of what that environment looks and feels like? Because it sounds like it could be a little bit sort of scary. Like something is amiss and we need to get together to talk about it. And you don't want to turn it into a bash fest where people come in and they start, calling out all the problems or calling out one another. So you sort of have to manage or referee that too, right? Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Definitely. So that's actually one of my favorite tips in here, I think. So I really like your phrasing of this as white space, but it's white space with you, the tech lead, sort of prepping the scene. So I agree. It can feel, especially if team dynamics are off kilter, it can feel really scary to go in and say like, hey, this engineer really just keeps introducing bugs and that's slowing us down. And the engineer is like sitting in the room and it feels really bad. So instead, I think that one way that I usually work around this is setting goals from the onset of the meeting. And on that slide, at least for the Premortems, I had an example list of goals. So usually like one of the goals will be, we come out of this with action items so we all feel better, or we all understand what's going wrong and how we need to work together to fix it. So you're setting the scene for the meeting though people are going to rant, and sometimes that's great because you get a lot of useful value out of it. You can also set the scene to note, like, this isn't a bash fest. We're not blaming everyone for what's going wrong. Like, we don't know what's happening in everyone's lives. We're just saying factually, like, this track of work has been blocking me, or like, this thing is really stressing me out. I'm not blaming anyone for it, but it is. So let's discuss how we can make that better. And I think that a big thing with these meetings, because I've definitely been in meetings where I found out something that I could have been doing way better as a technical lead. So it's important to explicitly state, like, we're not blaming each other. We're assuming best intent with what everyone's saying, easier said than done. And we're working towards reducing our stress. And hopefully everyone will have stuff that they learn about how they're doing or what they can be doing better or what they're already doing really well that actually is helping the team get through this difficult time. Hopefully everyone can leave the meeting with that. So I think expectation setting at the beginning of the meeting usually helps set up the scene to be more productive.
Awesome. And you pointed out two things that resonated with me in that answer. The first being, go into that meeting as well yourself with an open mind, because there may be feedback that comes your way that might be hard to swallow, or it might be something that you didn't recognize you were or were not doing correctly that might have been holding up the team. So be open to suggestions and advice, right? I think it's a great piece of advice. And also talk about the good things. Like, it can also be a white space where people talk about the things that are really working well, and you can build off of that. And that's important too, not to forget about what actually is moving the project along in a positive way. So that's awesome. Let's see. We do have a question from the audience from Jerry. Thanks, Jerry. Jerry asks, what are your methods to get buy-in from the team on action items and goals? So it's a two-parter. And then the second part, what are you looking for from team members to assure yourself that they get the big picture?
Okay. I'm going to have to ask you to repeat the second one once I answer the first one.
Sure. Sorry.
So the first one was, wait, sorry, actually, can you just repeat the first one?
Yeah, no problem. Methods for buy-in for getting the team to, action items and goals, and I guess acting on that, or, buying into some of the team action items and goals. What are your methodologies?
Yep. So during the meeting, I like to pay attention to who seems most passionate about something that's gone wrong. And I frequently like to give them the action item or ask them if they're willing to take that action item on that relates to whatever they're most passionate about. It's hard to convince someone who doesn't really care that a certain thing has gone wrong to like take extra time to make sure that that thing goes right. But I also really have found success in framing each action item and what it'll get us. So instead of just saying like, okay, now person X, you should be leading stand up every morning and this is how we're going to do it. I don't know. Instead of just saying that and leaving that blank, you can say, hey, you're leading stand up, but the whole reason that you're doing this is because all of these things that we just listed are really slowing us down and sort of making us miserable as a team. So you'll really be helping us by taking this on. And sometimes you can't convince someone to have buy-in. I think that like at the end of the day, it's just someone, like it's your job or it's the person's job. It's part of our work. We have to be mature. And like if something has sort of been delegated to us, make sure that it gets done. So hopefully you don't have to rely on that. But generally I found success in saying like, hey, you're passionate about this. This problem really bothers you. We discuss as a team how it can be fixed. It's up to you to fix it. And I always follow up if it seems like something isn't happening or is going wrong. And sometimes I end up being the one who has to do it. But usually I think that like leads to people being happy to take on that work. And can you remind me of the second question, please?
Sure. Yeah. First of all, great answer on the first part. I think Jerry would be very pleased with that. And those were all good pointers, especially part about buy-in and maybe somebody having trouble buying into, a particular goal or an action item. It's your job. It's kind of like, that's like the easy way out to say that, but like, that's why you work for this company. That's why you've been assigned this project. So it's kind of just baked in. Mm-hmm. The second part, sorry, I got a little off track there. What are you looking for from team members to assure yourself that they get the big picture? So it's sort of in line with what you already answered, but if you can elaborate on that a little bit.
That's a great question. I don't know if I look for any one thing in particular, or if it's more just like constantly massaging emotional intelligence to like try to see if people are feeling like they understand the big picture.
I know if I could cite an example from my side of things, it doesn't have to be constantly driven home, but maybe it's just kind of a refresher every now and again when you meet that you remind people of the end game or the end goal and what we're looking to, work towards. So just kind of a refresher. I know from my side of things, being a lead and or somebody who's being led by somebody else leading the project, that reiteration or reminder of where we're headed and why we're doing this sort of, it allows people to step back and say, oh yeah, I forgot. Sometimes you get lost in the weeds of doing the project that you forget, what you're actually working towards. And so that refresher, I think helps keep people on track, just from my personal experience.
Yeah, that's a really solid answer to this. And I'd like to add on, like, in terms of determining if your team members have bought in or understand that like larger vision. It's sort of weird because partially this job is on the project manager, or the person like really leading the overall project, not the technical side. But I think that one thing I really listen for is if I frequently just like talk to the engineers on my team because we're friends and we're working together. And I found it really helpful in these chats. Like if I notice that someone's just like, this is stupid, like I'm really tired of doing this project is a complete waste of time and stressing me out and like going on. I like to reflect on like why they feel that way. Sometimes some projects sort of are a waste of your time. And that might be a reason to like reflect back on like what needs to change around that. But if I'm hearing things like that, I'm also saying, hey, we clearly haven't as leads or as a team really established why this project matters, or why we think people should care. And it's really important for the people on your team to understand why it matters, because that serves for the motivation for like getting things done on time and like working with a positive attitude with all their other team members. So I like to listen sort of for times where people are either confused about why something is going on or are vehemently against like what is going on, and either determine like, does the project itself need to change? Because sometimes it does. Or are we not communicating why we're doing this properly?
Yeah, great answer. And I like the part about, if somebody's vehement, it's obvious and it's known and they're vocalizing it, but somebody might not be as vocal about it. And so you have to take those subtle cues and say, something might be amiss, and that it's just a skill sort of that you develop, right? When you lead teams and you lead projects, to be able to read people like that. So that's a great answer. So Jerry, thank you. Awesome question.
Thank you.
We still have some more time. We have other questions coming in, Lavisha. So I'm going to go to Gabriella. Thanks for the question, Gabriella. She asks, how do you handle performance achievements? If someone is doing quite well, how do you recognize his or her achievement? And you alluded to this, right, with those sort of impromptu meetings when something's amiss, but also calling out people who are doing things amazingly. How do you handle that?
So this might sound a little silly, but at my company in Slack, we have a Slack bot where you can give pluses to someone. The pluses they represent nothing. It's just like a number of times you've been plussed. And it seems silly, but it feels really good to get them. So I like to give both public and private admiration for stuff that I think people are really excelling at or just really killing it at. I naturally exist in a state where I focus on feedback that I have for folks, and especially positive feedback, because I think it's easier to continue to strengthen your strengths than to necessarily pull up your areas for improvement. So if someone's doing something really well, I like to give them props in a team channel, or I'll just message them and say like, hey, I noticed that you did this thing, you helped this other engineer out, and maybe this isn't something I need to address publicly, but I really love that you did that, and thanks. And also, since I'm a tech lead and I'm not an engineering manager, so I don't have control over someone's performance review or their salary or their promotions or whatever, I also make sure that like if someone's really doing well, I'll jot down all of my notes on like what I've loved about what they do, and then I just send it to their manager as a way to say like, hey, I don't know if you know all these things that this person is just like killing it at, but if you don't, or just in case you haven't caught all of them, here's all the ways that they're really excelling. And I really enjoy doing that because I think that it's easy as a team to focus on all the ways that something can go wrong or what has gone wrong, but those just provide little spots of joy along the way when someone's really doing well.
Awesome. Excellent. Yeah, I love to focus on the positive as well. So Great question. Thank you, Gabriella. Another question from the audience from Godiva. Godiva asks if you have any advice on staffing teams when you need technical and non-technical specialty expertise. So she works in an education technology startup in Jamaica, and it comes up quite a bit where they try to push through a project without an active project team. So do you have any staffing advice?
Oh, that's a bit out of my domain. Sorry.
Okay.
I don't work in that capacity.
Got it. Okay, fair enough. And so maybe, Godiva, we can take that offline, and maybe I can find an answer for you from an IEEE perspective here at my company. So, okay. Any other questions coming through? I'm just checking the chat, checking the question queue. I don't see anything else. So if that, and I want to remind people, because some folks had asked before the session had started, if the presentation will be shared, it will. Vesha said that we can send out a PDF of her slide deck, so you'll get that in addition to the recording. And that's it. We're just a shade under an hour. I'll take us out with one last final note. We do have our upcoming in-person, face-to-face Women in Engineering International Leadership Conference on May 23rd and May 24th in Austin, Texas. If you haven't registered yet or you're interested, please look at the website. It's IEEE Women in Engineering ILC, and you can get more information there. And that's it. I want to thank Vesha Parker from Etsy for an amazing presentation today, and everyone out in the audience for their participation. It was a really great session, Vesha, and I'll wish everyone a great rest of your day.